late 1942. An airfield in East Anglia, England. A group of British Spitfire pilots gathered on the wet tarmac, staring in disbelief at the new aircraft the Americans had just unloaded. They were used to their own machines, slender, elegant, weighing perhaps 3 tons fully loaded. What sat before them looked less like a fighter plane and more like a locomotive with wings. It was massive. It stood nearly 15 feet tall on its landing gear. Its fuselage was as wide as a truck. When an American pilot climbed into the cockpit, he didn't slide into a tight glove like in a Spitfire. He essentially walked into a room. The British pilots joked that if the pilot was attacked, he could simply unstrap himself and run around to the back of the cockpit to dodge the bullets. They called it a flying bathtub. They called it a jug. They wondered how something so grotesque could possibly stay in the air, let alone fight the nimble Messerschmitts of the Luftwaffe. This was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the British skepticism was about to be proven wrong by the laws of physics. To understand why the P-47 was a monster, you have to understand the mind of its creator, Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli was a Georgian immigrant, a former artillery officer who had fled the Bolsheviks. He didn't believe in elegance, he believed in firepower and speed. When the US Army Air Corps asked for a high-altitude fighter, Kartveli didn't start with the wings or the gun sights. He started with the engine. He chose the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. This was an 18-cylinder radial beast, an engineering marvel that produced 2,000 horsepower. It was the same engine used to lift heavy bombers, but putting a massive engine in a fighter creates a problem. To get 2,000 horsepower at 30,000 feet, where the air is thin, the engine needs to breathe. It needs a turbocharger. A turbocharger for an engine this size is not a small part. It is a massive system of piping, turbines, and intercoolers. In most planes, like the P-38 Lightning, the designers put the turbochargers in the wings or engine nacelles, but the P-47 had only one engine in the nose. Kartveli made a radical decision. He placed the turbocharger all the way in the back of the fuselage, in the tail. This meant he had to run massive ducting pipes from the engine in the front, underneath the pilot's feet, to the back, and then more pipes back to the engine. The plane was literally built around a giant loop of plumbing. This is why the P-47 was so deep-bellied and heavy. The pilot was sitting on top of the air intake system. The fuselage was essentially a wrapping paper for the propulsion system. When the prototype XP-47B first flew in May 1941, it weighed nearly 13,000 pounds. This was twice the weight of a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Traditional aviation wisdom said that a heavy plane climbs slowly and turns poorly, and initially this was true. The P-47 was a brick. It needed a long runway to get airborne. If the engine failed on takeoff, it dropped like a stone. There were accidents. Pilots were terrified of the compressibility effect in a dive, where the controls would freeze up as the heavy plane approached the speed of sound. But Kartveli had bet on energy. Once the P-47 reached altitude, the turbocharger kicked in. While the German fighters were gasping for air at 30,000 feet, their performance dropping off, the Double Wasp engine was just getting started. The P-47 was faster than anything else at high altitude, and more importantly, its weight gave it a terrifying advantage: the dive. Gravity loves mass. If a P-47 pilot pushed the nose down, the 7-ton machine accelerated like a falling anvil. No German plane could catch it in a dive. It could drop out of the sky, deliver a killing blow, and then use that massive kinetic energy to zoom climb back up into the safety of the stratosphere. It was a style of fighting called boom and zoom, and the P-47 was the ultimate hammer. The armament was equally unsubtle. While other nations were experimenting with cannons that had limited ammunition, the Americans stuck to the heavy 50 caliber machine gun. The P-47 carried 8 of them, 4 in each wing. When a pilot pulled the trigger, the plane unleashed a stream of lead weighing 13 pounds per second. The recoil was so strong that if the plane was flying slowly, firing the guns would actually stall it. The convergence of 8 streams of heavy bullets could saw a German fighter in half. It didn't need to hit a vital spot, it just needed to hit the plane. The kinetic energy of the 50 caliber rounds would tear wings off and shatter engine blocks. Despite these advantages on paper, the early days in England were hard. The missions in 1943 were short. The early P-47s had limited range. They were short-legged. They could escort the bombers only part of the way to Germany before having to turn back. This led to the perception among the bomber crews that the fighters were abandoning them. But the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, led by the charismatic Hub Zemke, began to develop the tactics that would define the plane. They stopped trying to dogfight the Germans. They stopped trying to turn. They learned to use the P-47 as a high-speed slasher. They formed the Wolf Pack. But the true revelation of the P-47 wasn't its speed or its guns. It was something that wasn't in the manual. It was something that the mechanics discovered when the planes returned from battle. They saw P-47s coming back with holes in the wings big enough to crawl through. They saw cylinders blown off the engine, yet the engine still running. They saw pilots landing with half a tail. The P-47 was not just a fighter, it was a flying tank. The Radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled engine of the Mustang or Spitfire, didn't have a fragile radiator. You could shoot a cylinder off a Radial engine, and it would cough, spit oil, and keep turning. This durability gave the pilots a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They knew they could fly through a wall of fire and come out the other side. As 1943 turned into 1944, the P-47 groups were the only thing standing between the Luftwaffe and the American bomber formations. They were outnumbered. They were fighting over enemy territory. But they had a machine that refused to die. And soon, a young pilot named Robert S. Johnson would demonstrate just how hard it was to kill a Thunderbolt in an encounter that would become legendary in the annals of air combat. A story of a single P-47 absorbing the firepower of an entire German squadron and refusing to fall. On June 26, 1943, the legend of the P-47's invincibility moved from theory to terrifying reality. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a 23-year-old pilot from Oklahoma, was flying his Thunderbolt, nicknamed Half Pint, on an escort mission over France. It was a routine operation until his formation was bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s coming out of the sun. In the chaos of the break, Johnson's plane was hit. 20mm cannon shells exploded against his fuselage. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit, shattering the hydraulic lines and spraying Johnson with hot, caustic fluid. His eyes burning, his plane falling out of formation, Johnson tried to bail out. He pulled the canopy release handle. It jammed. The metal track had been twisted by a shell impact. He was trapped. He wrestled with the canopy, kicking it, screaming at it, but it wouldn't budge. He was a prisoner in a falling coffin descending alone into the heart of occupied Europe. As Johnson struggled to regain control of his aircraft at lower altitude, he spotted a single German fighter sliding into position behind him. The Focke-Wulf 190 was piloted by a German ace, likely Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, though the identity remains a subject of historical debate. The German pilot saw the crippled American plane, leaking fluid and smoke, and moved in for the kill. He was methodical. He closed to within a few hundred yards and opened fire. The P-47 shuddered under the impact. The German 20mm cannons ripped holes in the wings and fuselage. The heavy machine guns hammered the armor plate behind Johnson's head. Inside the cockpit, the noise was deafening, like being inside a steel drum being beaten with sledgehammers. Johnson hunched his shoulders, waiting for the bullet that would pierce the armor and end his life. But the armor held. The German pilot, frustrated that the American plane wasn't falling, closed even further. He fired again. He targeted the wing roots and the engine. He poured hundreds of rounds of ammunition into the Thunderbolt. The P-47 absorbed it all. The control cables were severed, the rudder was unresponsive, the flaps were shredded, but the massive Pratt & Whitney engine kept roaring. Johnson, realizing he couldn't maneuver, did the only thing he could. He flew straight and level, hugging the English Channel, hoping to reach the white cliffs of Dover before he bled to death or his plane disintegrated. Then the firing stopped. The German pilot had run out of cannon ammunition. He pulled his Focke-Wulf alongside the Thunderbolt, flying wingtip to wingtip. He looked over at Johnson. He saw the American pilot, covered in oil and blood, struggling with the controls inside a cockpit that looked like a cheese grater. The German pilot shook his head in disbelief. He had never seen an aircraft take that much punishment and stay in the air. He rocked his wings in a salute, a gesture of chivalrous respect for a machine that refused to die, and peeled away to return to France. Johnson was left alone with his ruined bird. When Johnson finally belly-landed at the RAF airfield at Manston, the ground crews were silenced by the sight. They stopped counting the bullet holes after they reached 200. There were 21 20mm cannon hits. 5 cannon shells had exploded inside the fuselage. The rudder was hanging by a shred of metal. 1 propeller blade was shattered. And yet the pilot walked away. The incident became legendary. It sent a message through the 8th Air Force that changed the psychology of the American pilots. You are flying a tank. You can take the hit. The survival of Robert Johnson wasn't a miracle, it was physics. It was the direct result of the engineering choices made by Alexander Kartveli and the team at Republic Aviation. The primary reason the P-47 survived, while other planes like the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire would have been destroyed, lies in the engine cooling system. The Mustang and Spitfire used liquid-cooled inline engines. These engines required a radiator, usually mounted under the fuselage or wings, filled with coolant, glycol. The radiator is fragile. It is a network of thin aluminum pipes. If a single rifle bullet punctures the radiator or a coolant line, the liquid drains out. Within minutes, the engine overheats, the piston seize, and the plane falls out of the sky. A liquid-cooled plane is like a human. If you cut an artery, it bleeds out and dies. The P-47 used an air-cooled radial engine. The R-2800 Double Wasp had no radiator. It had no liquid coolant to leak. It was cooled by the air rushing over the massive metal fins of the cylinders. This made it incredibly robust. Their radial engine can take a direct hit to a cylinder head, literally having a chunk of the engine blown off, and the other 17 cylinders will keep pumping. There are records of P-47s returning to base with 2 or 3 cylinders completely destroyed, the engine coughing and spitting oil, but still producing enough torque to keep the propeller turning. The radial engine was not a delicate watch. It was a brute force anvil that simply ignored damage. Furthermore, the P-47's sheer size acted as armor. The turbocharger ducting system running along the bottom of the fuselage provided a second skin of steel pipes between the enemy fire and the pilot. The self-sealing fuel tanks were buried deep inside the structure. The pilot sat in a bathtub of armor plate. While the Japanese Zero relied on agility to avoid being hit, the Thunderbolt assumed it would be hit and was built to shrug it off. This design philosophy created a different breed of pilot. P-47 pilots became aggressive bullies. They didn't mind head-on passes against German fighters. In a head-on pass, both planes shoot at each other. The German pilots, flying fragile Bf-109s, would usually break off first because they knew one hit to their radiator meant death. The Thunderbolt pilot would stay the course, knowing his radial engine formed a massive shield of steel in front of him. This durability allowed the P-47 to perform a role it was never designed for: ground attack. As the invasion of Europe approached, the Allies needed a plane that could fly low, straight into the teeth of German flak batteries, to destroy trains and tanks. The P-51 Mustang was too fragile for this. A single bullet in the cooling system would bring it down. But the Thunderbolt was perfect. It could fly through a barrage of 20mm flak, lose half a wing, have its engine shot up, and still limp home. It became the premier mud mover of the war, a terrifying presence over the battlefields of France and Germany. The pilots developed a deep affection for the Jug. It was an ugly, heavy beast on the ground, difficult to taxi and thirsty for fuel. But in the air, when the tracers were flying, it was the only place they wanted to be. They knew that the war forge of Republic Aviation had built them a life insurance policy made of aluminum and steel. Robert Johnson went on to become one of the top American aces of the war, scoring 27 victories. He always credited his success not to his shooting, but to the fact that his plane allowed him to survive his mistakes. He survived the unsurvivable because he was strapped into the toughest fighter plane ever built. As the war progressed into 1944, the P-47 would face a new challenge. The Luftwaffe was introducing better aircraft, and the American commanders were demanding more range. The Thunderbolt engineers had to find a way to make this 7-ton monster fly all the way to Berlin. The solution would involve pushing the R-2800 engine to limits that the Pratt & Whitney engineers had never dreamed of, using a chaotic mixture of water and alcohol injection to turn the Thunderbolt into a hot rod, capable of chasing down the German jets. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven it could take a punch. But taking a punch isn't enough to win a war. You have to land one. The German pilots of the Luftwaffe had learned how to fight the Jug. They knew the American plane was heavy. Their tactics were simple. Climb. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 could climb at a steep angle that would cause the heavy P-47 to stall and fall away. The Germans would simply fly above the American formations, pick their moment, dive, attack, and climb back up to safety. It was a physics game, and the lighter German planes held the advantage of gravity. Alexander Kartveli and the engineers at Republic Aviation took this personally. They couldn't make the plane lighter. The armor and the turbocharger were essential, so they decided to apply more brute force. The solution came in the form of a new propeller. The standard propeller was thin, designed to slice through the air efficiently. The engineers replaced it with the paddle blade propeller. Imagine a canoe paddle. It is wide and flat. It grabs more water. The new propeller blades were massive, wide slabs of duralumin roughly 13 feet in diameter. When this propeller clawed at the air, it didn't just slice, it shoveled. The effect was instantaneous. The climb rate of the P-47 jumped. German pilots, accustomed to seeing P-47s struggle to follow them upward, were in for a nasty shock. In one documented encounter, a flight of Bf 109s attacked a P-47 formation and then zoomed upward, expecting to leave the Americans behind. Instead, the P-47s, utilizing the bite of the paddle blades and the power of the turbocharger, stayed right on their tails. The German pilots, looking in their rearview mirrors, saw the massive Radial engines getting larger, not smaller. They were shot down in a climb, victims of an engineering upgrade they couldn't see. But the propeller was just one half of the equation. The other was inside the cylinders. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine was rated for 2,000 horsepower, but the engineers knew it could produce more if they could just stop it from detonating. Detonation or knocking happens when the fuel explodes too early due to heat and pressure, destroying the engine. To cool the combustion chamber instantly, they added a system called water methanol injection. It was a small tank of water mixed with alcohol to prevent freezing. When the pilot pushed the throttle past the gate into war emergency power, the fluid was sprayed directly into the fuel mixture. The water flashed into steam, absorbing the heat. This allowed the manifold pressure to be cranked up to dangerous levels without blowing the cylinder heads off. With water injection engaged, the R-2800 screamed. It produced 2,800 horsepower for short bursts. The P-47 became a dragster. It could accelerate from cruising speed to combat speed in seconds. It turned the flying bathtub into a hot rod. The pilots loved it. They finally had a machine that could not only outdive the Germans, but outclimb and outrun them in a sprint. However, just as the P-47 was reaching its peak performance as an air superiority fighter, a political and logistical shadow fell over it. That shadow was the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had arrived in theater. It used the Merlin engine. It was sleek, and crucially, it burned half the fuel of a Thunderbolt. P-47 burned 100 gallons an hour. A P-51 burned 50 to 60. The P-47, even with drop tanks, had a limit. It could reach the German border, maybe a bit further. The Mustang could go to Berlin, Poland, and back. The U.S. Army Air Force commanders made a cold calculation. It was cheaper and more effective to send Mustangs to escort the bombers deep into Germany. The order came down. The P-51 groups will escort the heavies to the target. The P-47 groups will protect them part of the way, then turn back. The Thunderbolt pilots were furious. They were the veterans. They had held the line in 1943 against the best of the Luftwaffe. Now the glory boys in their Mustangs were going to get all the kills over Berlin. The P-47 pilots felt demoted. They felt their plane, the rugged survivor, was being insulted. Hub Zemke, the famous commander of the 56th Fighter Group, the Wolfpack, refused to trade his P-47s for Mustangs. He argued that the P-47's durability made it a better fighter because it brought men home. He won the argument for his group, which remained the only unit in the 8th Air Force to fly the P-47 until the end of the war. They proved their point by racking up massive kill scores. But for the rest of the P-47 groups, the mission changed. If they couldn't go to Berlin, they would go down. Go down to the deck, the orders said. Attack targets of opportunity on the way home. This order, initially seen as a consolation prize, would unlock the true terrifying potential of the Thunderbolt. The air war at 30,000 feet was a clean, duel-like environment. The war at 50 feet was a dirty, chaotic brawl against flak towers, trains, and tanks. And for this war, the P-51 Mustang was useless. Its liquid-cooled engine would pop like a water balloon with one rifle bullet. The P-47, however, was built for this. It was an armored anvil. In early 1944, the P-47 pilots began to drop their altitude. They started looking for trains. They started looking for airfields. They discovered that 8 50-caliber machine guns didn't just kill planes. They exploded locomotives. They cut trucks in half. They turned German infantry columns into red mist. The Jug was about to become the Jabo, Jagdbomber. And the German army on the ground, which had largely ignored the air war happening 5 miles above their heads, was about to learn a new definition of fear. The sky was falling, and it weighed 7 tons. By the summer of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had transformed. It was no longer the high-altitude interceptor Alexander Kartveli had designed. It had become the most terrifying instrument of tactical destruction in the European theater. The pilots of the 9th Air Force, tasked with supporting the invasion of Normandy, flew a different kind of war. They didn't worry about contrails or oxygen masks. They worried about church steeples, power lines, and the light flak that erupted from every hedgerow in France. They called themselves mud movers, and their office was at 50 feet above the ground, traveling at 350 miles per hour. The primary target of this new campaign was the German railway system. The Wehrmacht moved by train. If the trains stopped, the panzers ran out of fuel and the artillery ran out of shells. P-47 pilots developed a specific harrowing technique known as train busting. It required nerves of steel. The pilot would spot a steam locomotive chugging through the French countryside. He would dive at a steep angle, lining up his sights on the boiler. The goal was to puncture the pressurized steam vessel with 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. But physics made this dangerous. When the boiler exploded, it didn't just stop the train. It released a massive, expanding cloud of superheated steam and debris instantly. If the pilot was too close, or if he flew straight through the explosion, the steam could choke his own engine or obscure his vision, causing him to crash into the ground or the train wreckage itself. There are grim accounts of P-47s returning to base with pieces of wood, coal, and even parts of the locomotive engineer's uniform embedded in their oil coolers. It was a brutal, intimate form of violence where the attacker often had to fly through the guts of his victim. As the Allies broke out of the Normandy beachhead in August 1944, the P-47s were presented with a target-rich environment that would go down in history as the Falaise Pocket. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were encircled. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and staff cars were trying to escape through a narrow gap near the town of Falaise. The roads were jammed bumper to bumper. It was a traffic jam of desperate men. And overhead, the Thunderbolts were waiting. The pilots described the scene as a meat grinder. They didn't even have to aim. They simply lined up with the road and held the trigger down. The 8 50-caliber machine guns churned the column into a burning scrap heap. When they ran out of bullets, they dropped 500-pound bombs. When they ran out of bombs, they fired rockets. The carnage was absolute. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, touring the battlefield days later, famously remarked, "It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh." The P-47 had effectively destroyed 2 German armies from the air, proving that air power could win a ground battle. To accomplish this level of destruction, the P-47's loadout was increased to absurd levels. The Jug was so powerful, It could carry a payload that would have broken the back of a P-51 Mustang. A standard ground attack configuration included 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, a 500-pound bomb under the belly, and 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, high-velocity aircraft rockets. The HVRs, nicknamed Holy Moses by the pilots, were unguided missiles with the explosive power of a naval destroyer's shell. When a P-47 fired a salvo of rockets, it was like a flying artillery battery. The recoil was non-existent for the plane, but the impact could flip a Tiger tank upside down. This loadout meant a single P-47 could deliver 2,500 pounds of ordnance. To put that in perspective, the B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber with a crew of 10, typically carried a bomb load of 4,000 to 6,000 pounds on long missions. 2 P-47s, flown by 2 men, could match the destructive output of a heavy bomber, but with pinpoint accuracy. They could drop a bomb into a tunnel entrance or skip it through the front door of a Gestapo headquarters. The Germans developed a specific psychological terror of the Jabos, Jagdbombers. German tank commanders who feared nothing on the ground would button up their hatches and hide in the woods at the first sound of a radial engine. They knew the P-47s hunted in packs. If you shot one down, 3 more would descend on your position with napalm and rockets. The German movement was paralyzed by day. They could only move at night. This air paralysis was the P-47's greatest contribution to the war. It didn't just destroy equipment, it stole time. It prevented the Wehrmacht from maneuvering to stop the Allied advance. But this low-level war took a heavy toll on the pilots. Flying 3 or 4 sorties a day, constantly pulling high G-forces, constantly scanning for flak towers, left them physically and mentally shattered. The attrition rate was high not from enemy fighters, but from ground fire. Every German soldier with a rifle fired at the low-flying Thunderbolts. P-47s returned to base with tree branches stuck in their wings and telephone wire wrapped around their tail wheels. Yet, the rugged construction of the Republic Iron Works kept saving them. One famous photo shows a P-47 that hit a brick chimney while strafing a train. The wing was smashed, the leading edge crushed back to the spar, but the plane flew home. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the Allied armies raced toward the German border. The supply lines stretched thin. The weather began to turn. The P-47 groups were forced to operate from hasty, mud-choked airfields just behind the front lines. They were living in tents, eating K-rations, and flying until they were too tired to stand. But a new challenge was approaching. The Battle of the Bulge was looming, and the Thunderbolt was about to face its toughest test, fighting in a blizzard against the last desperate lunge of the Nazi war machine, where the difference between victory and defeat would be measured in feet of visibility and gallons of gasoline. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest. The temperature dropped to 0. A thick, suffocating blanket of grey fog descended on the hills of Belgium and Luxembourg, reducing visibility to a few yards. Under the cover of this weather, Adolf Hitler launched his last great gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein. 3 German armies, spearheaded by elite SS panzer divisions, smashed into the thin American lines. The timing was not accidental. The German meteorologists had predicted a period of heavy overcast skies. They knew that the Allied air forces were the greatest threat to their tanks. If the planes couldn't fly, the panzers could roll. For the pilots of the 9th Air Force, stationed at forward airfields in France and Belgium, the first week of the Battle of the Bulge was a torture of the soul. They sat in their tents, huddled around pot-bellied stoves, listening to the distant rumble of artillery getting closer. They played cards until the decks were worn out. They drank bad coffee and paced the flight lines. Outside, their P-47 Thunderbolts sat in rows, their wings covered in ice, their engines silent. They knew that just a few miles away, their friends in the infantry, the doughboys, were being slaughtered by King Tigers and Panther tanks. Every radio report from the front was a plea for help. "Where is the air support? We are being overrun." But the pilots could do nothing. To take off in that fog was suicide. To find a target was impossible. The mighty war forge of American aviation was paralyzed by water vapor. Inside the perimeter of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. They were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They dug foxholes in the frozen ground and waited for the end. The Germans sent a surrender ultimatum. General McAuliffe replied with one word: nuts. But bravado couldn't stop tanks. The paratroopers looked at the grey sky every day, praying for a hole in the clouds. They knew that the only thing that could stop the German heavy armour was the radial engine of a P-47. Then came the miracle. On the night of December 22nd, a high-pressure system from Russia began to push the fog westward. The temperature dropped even further, freezing the mud into concrete. And on the morning of December 23rd, the sun rose. It rose into a sky of brilliant, piercing blue. Not a cloud was in sight. On the Allied airfields, the scene was chaotic jubilation. Crew chiefs were already on the wings, chipping away the ice. Engines were coughing to life, spewing blue smoke into the crisp air. The orders from headquarters were simple: maximum effort. Everything flies. It was the greatest single day of air-to-ground combat in history. The 9th Air Force launched over 3,000 sorties. The sky over the Ardennes was filled with the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines. When the P-47s arrived over Bastogne, the paratroopers stood up in their foxholes and cheered. They waved colored panels to mark the German positions. The pilots looked down and saw the German columns exposed on the white roads, stark black targets against the snow. The Germans had become complacent under the fog. They were jammed bumper to bumper, thinking they were safe. They were wrong. The slaughter that followed was mechanical and relentless. The P-47s didn't just attack. They dismantled the German army. They started at the front of the columns and the back, destroying the lead and rear vehicles to trap the rest. Then they went to work on the middle. They used 500-pound bombs to flip Tiger tanks onto their backs. They used 50 caliber machine guns to shred the soft-skinned trucks carrying fuel and ammunition. The roads turned into corridors of fire. German tankers, trapped inside their steel beasts, frantically traversed their turrets trying to shoot down the planes with machine guns, but the P-47s were diving at 400 miles per hour, releasing their ordnance and pulling out mere feet above the trees. But on this day, the P-47s carried a new weapon, a weapon that would define the horror of modern war. It was a teardrop-shaped tank filled with a gelled mixture of gasoline and aluminum soap. It was called napalm. Until this point, firebombs were mostly used against cities. Now they were used tactically against tanks. The P-47s dropped the canisters on the German heavy armor. The tanks didn't need to be penetrated. When the napalm ignited, it created a fireball of 2,000 degrees Celsius. It sucked the oxygen out of the air. It flowed like liquid into the engine gratings and viewing slits of the Panthers and Tigers. It cooked the crews inside their own machines without ever scratching the paint. German soldiers who survived the attacks were left traumatized. They had faced artillery and bullets, but they had never faced a weapon that turned a snowy forest into an oven in seconds. The psychological impact broke the German advance. Crews abandoned intact tanks and ran into the woods rather than face the firebombs. By the end of the day on December 23rd, the German offensive was effectively dead. The P-47s had destroyed hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles. They had dropped supplies to the 101st Airborne. They had re-established the supremacy of the air. The flying tank had proven that it was the master of the winter, but the cost was high. The German flak gunners, desperate to protect their dying army, put up a wall of steel. Dozens of P-47s were shot down. Many pilots forced to belly land in the snow were captured or killed by SS troops. Those who made it back to base landed with branches in their intakes and holes in their windshields, their hands shaking from the adrenaline of 6 hours of continuous combat. As Christmas 1944 arrived, the Battle of the Bulge was won, not by the generals in the map rooms, but by the pilots who flew into the flak and the mechanics who kept the frozen engines running in the snow. The P-47 had saved the army, but the war wasn't over. The road to Berlin was open, and the Thunderbolt was about to lead the way across the Rhine into the heart of the Reich, where it would face the final, fanatical defense of a crumbling empire. Spring 1945. The Third Reich was shrinking. The Allied armies stood on the banks of the Rhine River, the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The bridges had been blown, except for one, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. As American troops poured across this fragile steel link, the Luftwaffe launched a desperate, suicidal effort to destroy it. They sent everything they had: Arado jet bombers, Stukas, even divers with explosives. But hovering over the bridge, from dawn until dusk, was a constant umbrella of P-47 Thunderbolts. They acted as flying artillery. They orbited in cab ranks, waiting for a radio call from the forward air controllers on the ground. If a German tank moved to attack the bridgehead, a P-47 dropped on it. If a German plane tried to bomb the bridge, a P-47 intercepted it. The Jug had become the guardian angel of the infantry, a presence so constant that soldiers felt naked without the sound of the Radial engine overhead. But in the skies above the crumbling Reich, a new threat appeared that challenged the P-47's dominance: the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. We have spoken of how the Mustang fought the jets, but the Thunderbolt's battle against the future was different. On paper, the P-47 shouldn't have stood a chance. The jet was 100 miles per hour faster in level flight. But the P-47 pilots discovered a terrifying quirk of physics. Gravity loves mass. When a 7-ton P-47 rolled over and went into a vertical power dive, it accelerated faster than any other propeller plane in existence. It dropped like a safe from a window. Major George Bostwick of the 63rd Fighter Squadron used this physics to kill jets. He knew he couldn't catch them in a climb or a turn, so he waited high above the German airfields. When he saw a jet, he would push the nose over and engage the water injection. The P-47 would scream downward, the airframe groaning under the stress, reaching speeds of over 500 miles per hour, approaching the sound barrier where the controls would lock up. In this terrifying dive, the P-47 could briefly catch the jet. Bostwick and others used this brief window, seconds only, to pour a stream of .50 caliber fire into the delicate jet engines. The Me-262s, built with fragile early metallurgy, would disintegrate under the impact of the heavy American bullets. It was the victory of a sledgehammer over a scalpel. As the war entered its final days in April 1945, the P-47s roamed Germany with total impunity. They flew so low that pilots reported having to pull up to avoid power lines and church steeples. They attacked horse-drawn columns, the last remnants of the Wehrmacht's logistics. The carnage was industrial. Pilots returned to base with their gun barrels burned out from firing so much ammunition. They were no longer fighting a war. They were administering the final coup de grace to a dying beast. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945, the statisticians of the Army Air Force began to compile the record of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The numbers were not just impressive, they were almost unbelievable. They revealed the true nature of the Allied victory. The P-47s flew 546,000 combat sorties. They fired 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. They launched 60,000 rockets. But it was what they destroyed that told the story. In the air, they shot down 3,152 enemy aircraft. But on the ground, they destroyed 86,000 railway cars. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives. They destroyed 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, tanks. They destroyed 68,000 trucks. Take a moment to visualize 68,000 trucks. That is a convoy stretching from London to Berlin. That is the entire logistical backbone of a modern army, wiped off the map by a single type of airplane. The P-51 Mustang gets the credit for defeating the Luftwaffe in the air. That is fair. It was the superior dogfighter. But the P-47 Thunderbolt defeated the Wehrmacht on the ground. It starved the panzers of fuel. It stopped the reinforcements from reaching the front. It broke the industrial capacity of Germany to wage war. The Warforge of Republic Aviation had built 15,686 Thunderbolts. They were built in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. They were flown by farm boys and factory workers. They cost $83,000 each, and they were the most survivable fighter of the war. The loss rate of the P-47 was incredibly low, only 0.7% per mission. Thousands of American pilots came home to their families, grew old, and had children, solely because Alexander Kartveli decided to wrap a massive engine in a bathtub of steel ducts and armor plate. Today, the P-47 is often overshadowed by the sleek lines of the Mustang or the Spitfire at air shows. It looks bulky. It looks old-fashioned. But to the men who flew it, and to the men on the ground who saw it diving to save them, it was the most beautiful shape in the sky. It was the flying tank, the jug, the anvil of victory. It proved that in a total war, you don't always need the sharpest sword. Sometimes you just need the heaviest hammer. And the Thunderbolt was the heaviest hammer the world had ever seen,